Yesterday, James Clapper spoke about threats to the United States, said it was the most dangerous time, I think, of his lifetime. Now, he's talking about North Korea and Iran, but ISIS was a very significant part of his discussion. I'm just wondering, you seem rather sanguine about the situation, certainly regarding ISIS and terrorism, but a lot of us are very worried. I just wonder if you'd like to expand on that.
Yeah, well, Director Clapper, of course, is a very bright guy, and he's been around as a U.S. intelligence officer since the Vietnam War. And so, yeah, we certainly have to take his views seriously. But that said, until the collapse of the Soviet Union, we faced the possibility of mutually assured destruction. I mean, that was the biggest threat imaginable. We face nothing like that today. No state, we spend, I think we spend as much as the next 17 countries on our national defense. I mean, we're pretty, North Korea may do something dumb. I mean, by the laws, it looks like they're planning to do something dumb. But to what extent can they really attack us? I think it's not at all clear that they have ballistic missiles that could even reach Hawaii. So yes, it's a little uncertain, it's a little unstable. I mean, a paradox of the Cold War is that if it ended badly, it would have ended, we'd not be in this room because we'd all be dead. But it also there were kind of rules of the road, and it was somewhat stable, and we had a lot of proxy wars that killed millions of people, but we didn't actually have an actual face-to-face confrontation. But that said, of course, whether it was the Cuban Missile Crisis or other, we came very close. So I think it's historically, as an historical matter, it's simply wrong to say that this is the worst time in our history. There's certainly some uncertainty. I think if we look at our history, I mean, there have been 3 existential crises in the United States. There was the Civil War, where the nation could have basically, dematerialized. There was the Nazis' rise in Europe, in which case, if they had succeeded, Western liberal democracies of many stripes would have gone. And then there was the Cold War. Now, compare this era to those. I mean, it's apples and oranges. It's very different. And I mean, while I have a lot of respect for Director Clapper, I just think, and of course he's paid to worry about these issues, and that's his job. And the job of the Director of National Intelligence is to provide strategic warning to policymakers of what the problems are likely to be. And I think he does a very able job of that. But you mentioned the word sanguine, maybe, but I do feel as a historical matter, we're kind of in a different space, I don't see. I actually think that we're in a period of fairly unprecedented peace and prosperity. And in fact, if you want to zoom out a bit further, Steven Pinker has a very good book called The Better Angels of Our Nature, which I think makes it an enormously compelling point that the rates of violence have been going down precipitously. The likelihood that you might be killed in some kind of violent attack, if you compare it to the 17th century or the 16th century, or then go back to even further, I mean, it is getting less and less and less and less. And that is, I don't think anybody can argue against that. That said, of course, history will surprise us, and maybe North Korea will develop a nuclear weapon and will precipitate some kind of war with South Korea, into which we'll have to intervene, and it gets bigger and bigger. But that seems, I just don't see the big problems with we've had major interstate wars in the past that killed tens of millions of people. We don't. That seems sort of unlikely right now.
I've heard a lot of talk about jihad. We were all hearing this. It's in the news all the time. Is there another cult or something out there that is slipping between the cracks while we so focus on the jihad issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's
it's hard to believe that Muslims would be the only ones running around worldwide.
I mean, if you look at if you look at the wars that are going on in the world right now, many of them are going on in Muslim countries. So, and I think that we're in the middle of we're at the very beginning of a Sunni-Shia regional civil war that is taking place in Iraq and in Syria and Yemen, and it's being fomented by both Iran and Saudi Arabia, and they, and I think that's a big problem for the Middle East that's not going to go away, and I think that it is important. But in terms of your question, is there some other group out there motivated by some other ideology that might attack us? I mean, certainly we're seeing relatively small numbers of extreme right-wing militants killing fellow Americans. But Yogi Berra famously said it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future, and so it's hard for me personally to discern what other ideology is sort of attracting recruits. And I mean, in the pre-9/11 era, it was obvious to myself, but also obvious to a certain number of people in the U.S. government and some other journalists that this thing, Bin Laden, Al Qaeda, was going to be a problem. I didn't necessarily anticipate it was going to be materialized so dramatically in the United States, but I can't. A lot of the violent ideologies have actually run their course. So there may be a few Marxists on some campus in Vermont, but there are. I mean, Marxism as an idea is basically dead, and there was a lot of violence done in the name of Marxism over this century. And in fact, one of the points I try and make in the book is this book is not a critique of religion at all. The secular political religions of Nazism and communism created more human damage than any of the other creeds that have preceded them. And I think the point I try and make is that we are an ideological species, and we want something to explain what is, after all, a very complicated and sometimes mystifying world. And so in the quest for meaning and ideology, some people will be attracted to this kind of bin Ladenist idea. But I don't see a lot of other forms of ideology out there right now that are engaging young people that claim to have found the truth. I mean, we know when people say, "I found the truth," that there will often be a trail of dead bodies in its wake. That's almost a sort of law of politics. Right now, there aren't a lot of people making that claim that are in positions of power and have armies. And
one thing I didn't have time to ask you about, but you just referred to media and yourself and other journalists who had a sense of that something was happening with this particular thing. What's your view of how well American media in particular is doing these days, particularly in light of what a bad job we did, generally speaking, not necessarily you, in the lead up to the Iraq invasion and our sense of that over time, because, and I would venture and see what you think about this, that it's a version of a similar kind of perhaps not entirely empirically based reaction, that a sense of tremendous anxiety, and that the country has huge anxiety about these kinds of things, that journalists these days tend to continue to be somewhat vulnerable to the most distressed voices, and not.
Well, I mean, Doug, you worked in the business for a long time. You continue to work in the business through this show. I mean, the natural bias of journalism is towards bad news. I mean, you mentioned, we don't cover hurricanes that didn't happen. We cover hurricanes that did happen. I mean, news is generally bad news. It's not good news. We don't cover the wonder, how cuckoo clock production in Switzerland and how great it's doing. It's just not really a news story. It's sort of, so the reason that you mentioned Clapper's comments, it attracted it got some coverage, and I think that.
But are folks doing a good enough job of pushing back in the way that you are now?
Well, I mean, when you're on a deadline, and he's a newsmaker, and he's just said this. I mean, it's hard to do a kind of really informed rebuttal when you've got 2 hours to basically. So I think the media, I get asked a form of that question fairly often, because it's really. Maggie Thatcher famously said that the oxygen of terrorism is publicity. And so the corollary of that is, if they'd got no publicity, there'd be no terrorism. But, unfortunately, do the thought experiment where we didn't cover 9/11, or we didn't cover the Paris attacks, or we didn't cover the Bernardino. I mean, these are big news stories. Now, you can say that they may be overly done, or there's too much concentration, but the fact is these are genuine news stories, and the media would be derelict if they weren't trying to cover them. And I do think the media is, we at CNN, and I think this is true, other networks, do not air ISIS videos. If we refer to them, it's a frame grab. Now, the cause has left the bomb, because if you want to see the video, it's available, but at least you're not seeing it on CNN. Yeah. I've noticed, Anderson Cooper, CNN's chief anchor, and others I notice are increasingly less likely to talk about the perpetrator, whether it's a school shooting or try and not mention his name. One of the scenes I have in the book is Kerry Cahill, whose father was killed by Major Nidal Hassan. She comes into her mother isn't eating for obvious reasons after the attack. She's going into a store to buy Ensure for her so that she eats something, and she sees Time magazine. The cover is Major Nidal Hassan. And she's of course extraordinarily pissed off, and she complains to Time and others about like, why do we keep talking about? So I think the media does exercise restraint.
Veering away from the domestic scene, Peter, what would be good tidings for our country of one of the players in the Middle East, like a heart attack in Turkey and Erdogan's out, or a phoenix rising in Egypt? If you were somewhere between crystal ball and if you were the poobah.
There's a lot of bad news going on because in Saudi Arabia you've got a new king who's very influenced by his son, who's making, I think, a lot of mistakes. They invaded Yemen and they've basically turned a failing state into a failed state with their, I think, fairly ham-handed invasion. You've got in Egypt, Sisi is worse than Mubarak in terms of he's putting tens of thousands of people in prison. He's criminalized the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a major political party of millions of people. He's much more authoritarian than Mubarak, and he's fairly popular amongst a large number of Egyptians. And then in Libya, you've got, Gaddafi was an absolutely terrible human being, but you've got a situation where people are, somewhat nostalgic for Gaddafi. And the same is true in Iraq, by the way. We have Iraqi friends whose own family members were killed by Saddam, who are saying, 13, 14 years later, wow, this is what we knew what we'd get. So, there's a lot of bad news. I do think the Iranian deal has some promise because the Iranians are keeping to the deal. And that's one nation. If the Iranians began to have a nuclear weapon, then the Saudis would almost certainly follow suit. And, you can the Iranians and Saudis are, they could kind of go to war at some point. They already are going to war in these proxy wars in Yemen and other places. So I don't see, there's nothing really that's that predictable that makes this situation look a lot better, unfortunately.
Well, we'll end on that depressing note. Thank you very much.
It's good to be in the US of A.